On behalf of Fortenbaugh family, Civil War Institute, and my colleagues in the History Department, I'd like to welcome you all to the 61st Annual Fortenbaugh Lecture. The Robert Fortenbaugh Memorial Lecture is presented each year on November 19th, the anniversary of the Gettysburg Address. The goal of the lecture is to honor the memory and spirit of Lincoln's visit to Gettysburg. Traditionally, we have asked a renowned scholar to provide a public lecture about a topic related to the American Civil War. This year, we have something a little different for you, a panel discussion. 3 for the price of 1. I will turn you over to my colleague, Peter Carmichael, Director of the Civil War Institute, to explain more.
Good evening, you all. Dina is correct. As you can see, we don't have one Fortenbaugh lecture. We have 3, a new format for us. This conversation will do for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we're going to turn it over to you all. There will be 2 microphones, which I don't see them right now, but I'm sure they will be there in just a little bit, for you to ask questions of our panelists. This evening, we'll be talking about the state of Civil War military history. Let me do a quick introduction of our 3 Fortenbaugh panelists. On my far right, Lorien Foote. She is the Patricia and Bookman Peters Professor in History at Texas A&M University. She told me she was, Craig, no offense to this, she was disappointed that Dr. Gallagher was not here. Gary Gallagher is a graduate of the University of Texas. And as we know, the Aggies and the Longhorns, they don't mix there anymore. They don't play nice at all. Craig is from UCLA, and UCLA has been irrelevant in football for years. I can't wait to see them come to the Big Ten and get beat by Northwestern. So Lorien is the author of 4 books. She's the editor of 3 volumes. Her most recent book is Rights and Retaliation. She also wrote a fantastic book called Yankee Plague, which looks at escaped Union prisoners and the collapse of the Confederacy. My favorite book that Lorien has done, called The Gentleman and the Roughs, Manhood, Honor, and Violence in the Union Army. Fantastic book. And I believe, didn't David Brooks, the New York Times columnist, he did a piece, it wasn't just on your book, but he certainly gave it a lot of play, which of course, as we know in the academic world, it's unusual that anyone reads our books outside that small circle. David Brooks read yours. Next to Lorien is Craig Symonds, Professor of History Emeritus at the United States Naval Academy. He's taught there for more than 30 years. 2017 to 2020, he was the Ernest J. King Distinguished Professor of Maritime History at the U.S. Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. He is the author of more than 17 books, a staggering number. Some of those books include Lincoln and His Admirals, which was the winner of the 2009 Lincoln Prize. Where is the bust of Abraham Lincoln? Everyone who wins the Lincoln Prize, they get a nice check, but they get this beautiful bust. Where is it in your house? When you walk right into the
When you walk in the front door, it's right in front of you. Can't miss it.
He's written a number of Civil War books as well. He's really turned his attention to World War II. His most recent book, Nimitz at War, and that was published in 2022. If you ever subscribe to the Teaching Company, which has a wide range of courses on history, Craig has done 2 courses, one on naval history during World War II.
In the Pacific, yes.
And the Pacific, excuse me. And then the second class that you found is just U.S. naval history in general.
Correct.
All right, Craig, again, thank you so much for joining us. And finally, we have Jen Murray, who is wearing her Gettysburg colors tonight, which I was really pleased to see. Way to go, Jen. But then Jen reminded me, she's a PhD from Auburn University, which is orange, and Oklahoma State, where she currently teaches, which is also orange as well. So wonderful consistency there, Jen. We're going to see that kind of Gettysburg. Jennifer is the teaching assistant professor at Oklahoma State University. She is the author of On the Great Battlefield, The Making, Management, and Memory of Gettysburg National Park. It's published by the University of Tennessee. She is currently working on a full-length, I want to underscore that, biography of George Gordon Meade. Jen, how many pages is your manuscript right now? How many?
It's over 800 right now. It's more than you want it to be right now.
It's a lot, and I happen to be her series editor at UNC Press, and so I've got a lot of reading ahead of me. I'm anxious to see it, as many others are. We are in much need of a modern biography of George Gordon Meade. It was mentioned at dinner that Jen has spent much of her professional career as a historian right here in Gettysburg, working at the National Park, and she has gone on to bring that passion to her students at Oklahoma State University. Now 2 years, I think, running, Jen, has made it possible for her students to have internships in national parks, and she's done fundraisers so that she can pay for her students to come to the Civil War Institute, second weekend in June. We're going to have a array of speakers and talks, and tours. That says everything about her. Committed scholar, committed teacher, and it's always a pleasure to have her students from Oklahoma State here. So I have the first question for the evening. As the moderator, of course, my job is to throw out the question and then run away from the panel and let them go at it. I'm always suspicious, though, of moderators who say, oh, I'm just going to stand back and just let them talk. What inevitably will happen is I will jump in from time to time. My goal is maybe to play the contrarian, which I'm more than happy to do. But I suspect that the three of them here, that they'll find plenty to discuss, and maybe a good bit to even disagree about. So, our first question. Is it possible to understand the Civil War without placing military affairs near the center of the story? And I knew my first question would stump them. This is always what happens. Should we just go to the next question?
I was just trying to think about how to say what I want to say without sounding too kind of nuanced and academic-y in how I answered the question. Because I think one of the key parts of that question, Pete, is that you said near.
I did say near.
And you didn't say at the center of the story. So I think the Civil War is a war, and so of course military affairs have to be near the center of what you talk about when you do history. And I think, if I think about topics that maybe many years ago we thought of as completely separate from military affairs. So let's say I want to write the history of women in a small town in Vermont. That seems very far from the battlefield and very far from military affairs in many ways. Military affairs still have to be near the center. And the reason is because whether or not there's a draft in that community and how many men are taken from that community affects the community. Whether that woman's husband is accused of cowardice by all the other men in his regiment, and they're riding back to their community and going, you know, John Smith we couldn't see him in the battle, he was behind a tree. That ruins her life as well as his. Where that regiment is on battlefields affects their casualty rate, which affects the economics and the social life of that community. So to me, you can't even talk about a community and women's history without placing military affairs near the center of the story.
So I will add to that, and thank you for being here tonight. This is quite an honor to be on the stage 160 years from the Gettysburg Address with my distinguished colleagues, and thank you, Pete, for the invitation to be here. Adding to Lorien's comment, I teach our military history classes at Oklahoma State in addition to doing Civil War, and that first day of class, whenever the students are there and very eager and you hand out the syllabus to them, I always mention to them that you can't understand American history without understanding conflict. And if you look at our nation's history starting back to 1607 and you move forward to 2023, the United States is at war, externally or internally, some 94% of our history. So it is impossible to understand American history without privileging combat. So I certainly think that it is impossible to understand the American Civil War without privileging conflict. This is a war that consumed nations and peoples from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania to Honey Springs, Oklahoma. Some 3 million participants involved, engulfed communities. And I was thinking about this question particularly, and I wanted to see maybe what Abraham Lincoln thought about this, about war itself. And as I'll paraphrase, it's kind of a bit of a lengthy quote, but he says, "Upon our arms, all else depends." Upon the progress of our arms, all else depends. So restoration of the Union, preservation of the Union, and by January of 1863, emancipation is going to depend on the soldiers in the Union armies. So it is impossible to talk about the Civil War without privileging military affairs.
I think the first thing I have to say this evening is that yesterday afternoon, UCLA beat USC by 2 But in response to your question, I think it is critical that military history is at the center, not only of the great trauma that was the American Civil War, but as Jen says, of all of American history. And military history, unfortunately, in my personal opinion, has been shunted aside in a lot of our prestigious universities as being, battles and leaders, and we're not really into that sort of thing. But military history is the thing that shows you what were the most important central issues of a culture and a society, the issues for which that society was willing to expend its treasure and its most valuable asset, the blood of its citizens. If you can understand why a country would decide to take that road into military conflict, it's exposing to all of us what the important values were for that culture, for that society. So I would argue that not only is military history central to understanding the Civil War, as Jen suggested, and Lorien too, it's central to understanding history itself. So I think that is a critical reason. And I'll mention one more thing about why military history is so important. The Civil War was transformational in a lot of ways to American society and culture, in its economics, the mass production of goods to feed and support a massive army in the field, changed the American economy forever, changed the banking system, the transportation system, obviously changed its politics. And so understanding the military issues is central to understanding the growth and expansion and change of the United States itself.
You all three have made very persuasive, powerful explanations as to why military history is so important. But very quickly, why is it on the decline in the academy?
Well, by academy, you don't mean the United States Naval Academy. Where I assure you it is not on decline. Students of a certain age, and I think all three of us have experienced this, and Jen referenced this in her remarks, are fascinated by conflict, by confrontation in the field. And that's especially true, I think, of the students that I taught for 30 years, because they were going to find themselves in a confrontational situation. So for me, the military confrontation was a hook to get them interested in an understanding of the much broader issues of the culture and the society and the economics that created that environment. So I think it's both useful as a way to draw students into it, but it's also useful in understanding why those soldiers did it. I mean, we have all heard comments lately about why would young men raise their hand, go into the field, risk their lives, sacrifice their lives for an idea, for a principle, for each other. I assure you, they're not suckers and losers. They are patriots. And I think understanding their motivation is also central to understanding what's going on in the United States at any given time.
But why is it that most colleges don't value that? Because military history is on the decline.
So what I would say, and maybe this is because I'm Generation X, and part of what we do as Generation X is blame everything on the baby boomers.
Hey, I'm sitting right here.
I'm gonna say it's on the decline in the academy because of the baby boomers, because of what happened in the 60s. I think the turmoil in the 60s, the conflict in universities, the rise of political ideologies in the universities that associated military history with pro-war ideology kind of began to undermine that because of some of the politics in the 60s and 70s, because that's where we really start seeing a pushback against military history is in that time. And I think as some universities turned away from teaching that and hiring people, you have less and less people being trained in it. And military history, I think, is very difficult. Because you have to learn how to read sources and handle sources in a very different way than some of the other subfields of history, which have a lot of similarities in how you're going to read what a diary says or read what letters say. But to actually try to figure out from all of these conflicting battle accounts, to be able to have the kind of thinking that you can read a military map and follow these kind of movements, that's a different kind of training. And I think I say that because I didn't have that training when I was in graduate school. There was no one who did military history at my university. So I had to train myself, and I had to go and do a summer seminar in military history with the Society for Military History. And it was really difficult work for me because it was so different. So I think once that kind of got lost a little bit, and we lost some of the people who were trained in that, it became more difficult than to pick up training people again. That's just my perspective.
Yeah, I certainly agree, and I like your point, Lorien, about how reactionary academics tend to be. And you can look through job ads now, and you'll see that they're hiring for social or cultural issues. I think it's generally the case that people look at academic military historians as the realm of antiquarians, and somehow if you studied war, you lust for war, is this kind of equation. Positions that are strictly military historians, like mine at Oklahoma State, are incredibly rare. I'm very lucky to be in the position that I am to teach these kind of classes that are war-focused, but we're not training a lot of new PhDs. There aren't a lot of junior academics that really work on traditional military history topics, and I think we'll see kind of the consequences of that in the scholarship for some time to come.
But I think there's also going to be a pushback, because one of the things that I think that we see in history is this constant pendulum swing. There'll be, a movement in one direction, and then there's kind of a counter reaction to that. And I think because military history actually remains constantly popular with students, and especially at a place like Texas A&M, where we have 3,000 cadets on our campus. I mean, we could literally put 2,000 students a semester in military history classes if we had the faculty to offer that. And I think there's been, I think there is a pushback, certainly from our students who are emailing our department head going, when are you going to teach that World War II military history class again? When are you going to, and I think it's going to be interesting to see. I think students are going to start pushing back, is my opinion, and we might see a swing back.
Yeah, I think that's quite possible. I think you're both absolutely correct. I think the 60s is part of it. I think part of it, too, is that the Academy, small a, looks upon military history as kind of mechanical. X's and O's on the chalkboard, and he went here in the left flank and the right flank. And that's simply not as deep and doesn't have sufficient gravitas compared to, well, the trilogy is race, class, and gender. These are the things that explain modern culture and society. And students who ask me, well, I would like to explore military history as a graduate student. I said, well, then you have to do something like, gender studies in the military, because you have to frame it in a way that a university would accept your dissertation proposal.
But what I think is kind of sad about how things have been framed is that I think that the best military history has always been what we kind of call now war in society.
Yeah.
But military historians have always had to understand how cultural attitudes affect a military institution and its commanders and the decisions that they make. They have always studied the kind of connection between the politics of a society and the war that it's fighting
Yep.
and what's going on the home front, that's been something great military historians have always done. They're never separate, in my view, the society and the military aspects.
Absolutely.
But is there something lost with this war and society approach? I mean, I'm mildly amused when I hear military historians will never say, I'm a military historian, because they're nervous, right, in the academy. And so, I do war and society, I do war and society. But the fact remains, what defines military history is the study of organized killing. That's what makes it distinctive. And I get everything that the three of you have said, and how people perceive individuals who study that. They're sort of like, oh my God, how can anyone study that and not be a warmonger? I get it. But what I think has been lost with this emphasis, war and society, doesn't generalship matter? And so,
I think so.
okay, so then the fact is that we would never ever send any student off at the graduate level to study generalship, because we know that that person would never ever get a job at a college level. So let's talk about why traditional military history, the study of battles, campaigns, of generals, can that not be studied in isolation? Does everything have to be rooted within a war and society approach?
So I think it is always the job of a historian to explain how that research is important and significant to the biggest number of people. When I was in graduate school, and you'll see where I'm going with this in a moment. When I was in graduate school, my advisor called this, you know, when you write Lorien, you have to answer the BFD question. Big freaking deal, only he didn't say freaking. But the BFD question, why does this matter to anyone besides the little narrow scholars that, might study this? So I think what happens is there's a perception that studying generalship and command decisions only matters to people who are going to become practitioners. So why should someone who's an undergraduate history major that is going to go out into the world and have to make decisions and be a good citizen and have a job that doesn't have to do with the military, why should they understand these military problems? And one answer military people are always giving, well, if you study command decisions, then you'll understand how to be a good leader in civilian society, right? But I think the problem is, in fairness, sometimes some traditional military historians actually aren't that good at articulating why a study of Meade at Gettysburg should matter to people who don't practice war themselves. And I do think it's up to military historians to explain what the BFD is about studying generals, about studying where the 15th Army Corps was at Chickamauga.
And why it was there. What she said, it's a good answer. I do, however, want to suggest that, Pete, you might want to reframe the question, generalship and admiralship. Because what we're talking about is leadership, organization, and the management of people. I mean, leaders in the military have to not only articulate a strategy, a program, and the logistic support for that strategy, which is a huge business-related kind of environment, but also the management of the subordinates who work for them. And you can't just, even though it sounds delightful, that you could give an order and, I say come and he comes, I say go and he goes. Life is not like that. Military life is not like that. Military campaigns are not like that. When you study military campaigns, when you study Meade at Gettysburg or anywhere else, when you study Lee and his lieutenants, what you see is a dynamic of personalities and circumstances where individuals have to take into consideration the relationship, not only of the events in front of them and the circumstances, but also the personalities who are involved. And that's humanity. That's understanding the world in which we all live.
I think there's always a lot of anxiousness about our field. Is military history on the decline? There's articles written in prominent Civil War journals about that over the last couple of years. But another way to look at it is to think we're incredibly fortunate. I mean, look at this audience tonight. Any number of you are interested in the Civil War through military campaigns and leaders and strategies and George Meade and other Army commanders of the sorts. So we have this audience that has this insatiable appetite for Civil War military history. It might not win the awards in our field, the Tom Watson Brown Prize or the others such in academia, but we write for an audience that is incredibly hungry for these sorts of questions and find value in our work. And I find that uplifting. I certainly find that inspirational. These conversations and these opportunities to talk about generalship and admiralship.
Thank you.
And UCLA football.
Thank you.
And the fact that OSU beat OU in Bedlam.
So, what I love about Oklahoma State people is they win one game out of 45. I mean, beat them 45 years in a row, and they win one. I went to the University of Oklahoma, and you know they think this one win defines their whole thing.
I'm an Auburn PhD, so that works with Alabama. I'm used to it. We're talking about football.
Take control, Pete.
Man, I'm enjoying this. Look, I'm an Indiana University football fan, so I'm way out to pasture on this. Look, I was curious how you all debate William Tecumseh Sherman. How should we understand Sherman? No, I'm serious. I want to see how you all are going to approach it, to take some of this methodology that you've spoken about, and so let's see how you really use it when you think about someone like Sherman.
Well, let me start. My friend John Marszalek is somewhere in this audience tonight. He wrote the book about what I still think is the definitive book about William Tecumseh Sherman. A soldier's passion for order, not the thought that a lot of people immediately think about William Tecumseh Sherman. We were in, I forgot, Beaufort or Beaufort, South Carolina. Thank you. And I was sitting with a Southern historian who will not be named, and explaining to me why William Tecumseh Sherman is in fact a war criminal. And I was explaining to him why maybe that he could rethink that assessment. And he looked at me and he said, well, look, let me ask you this. What do people in the North say when they sit around at night talking about William Tecumseh Sherman? Steve, you know, Northerners don't sit around talking about William Tecumseh Sherman the way the people here in South Carolina seem to do. But Sherman, I think, is a personification, a tipping point, a pivot point between what was considered the character of warfare in the years before the American Civil War and the character of warfare in the years following the Civil War. It's one of the things that makes the Civil War so fascinating to us. It's really the only total war in which the United States has ever participated because it took place here. The mass mobilization of armies, the support of those armies in the field, the destruction of cities, the loss of life among civilians, all of that is new stuff, by and large, for Americans. And I think that's why Sherman is so important. And the fact that I had this conversation with an individual in South Carolina suggests to me that that still is recognized as a moment in American history where something shifted.
So what I think is fascinating, Sherman to me is an example of what I see as that inherent has to be an interplay between traditional military history and an understanding of the culture. Because one of the things that's fascinating to me, there's a man named Henry Hitchcock who he joins the war right before Sherman leaves from Atlanta, and he's on Sherman's staff. And like all Americans at that time period, he is absolutely obsessed with making sure that the Civil War is civilized. They use that word all the time. Civilized. We don't want to be savage. We've got to show that we're civilized. So he'd sat out the war as a lawyer in St. Louis, and he joined Sherman's army. And his diary is fascinating because he's obsessed with finding out, have I joined a civilized army? So every night during Sherman's march through Georgia, he's running around to all of the campfires with all of the wing commanders, corps commanders, brigade commanders. Did your men pillage anybody tonight? Did you burn something? How civilized were we? Did you punish people appropriately? And so I think it's interesting to look at Sherman's army's behavior, how it interacted with citizens in Georgia, how the army changed, with understanding how people within that force tried to restrain themselves, where they unleashed violence, and how they justified it, plays a role in every aspect of that march.
But go ahead.
No, go.
I was just going to add that, I think this is to the point of why military history matters, is the American Civil War is our nation's most defining epoch, period. There is no other event that has more long-term consequences than what happened between 1861 and 1865. And rather than reducing these personalities to these kind of canards, Sherman is crazy and Grant's a drunk and Meade is slow and doesn't pursue. We need to understand these people in the context in which they lived and how the Civil War influenced them and how they influenced the Civil War. And at the end of the day, if we do that, we've bridged that gap of 160 years ago and can make this event, the Civil War, our nation's most defining epic, more understandable. To embrace the complexities of Meade or Sherman is the reward and also the challenge of the historian.
Did you, Craig, did you have something?
No, go ahead.
We're
Move
waiting
on.
for your next one.
So, when I think about battle studies, which are immensely popular with general audiences, our battle studies, do they offer us the kind of deep insights that you believe military history currently does in the academy? Are battle studies something, I think it was Paul Fussell called battle studies, a Disney-fied version of warfare?
When I first began teaching the Civil War at the Naval Academy in the early 1970s, I gathered together syllabi from various courses across the country, and one of them struck me in particular because he talked about the causes of the war. He spent 6 weeks on what caused the war, how did it begin, what were the political confrontations, social, cultural, and then we get right up to Fort Sumter, and then he said, and then they fought a war. And then they dealt with the problems of Reconstruction, passing over the whole issue of the battle studies themselves. And I was appalled by that. Not only because for my students, that was the meat and potatoes of the whole course, but also because I think what happens on the battlefield is a microcosm of those larger questions. And so my view as a military historian, a proud military historian, is that the campaign studies, the X's and O's on the chalkboard, if you would, are essential, are critical to understanding what happened because it changes over time. I mean, look at what happened. We talked about Sherman just a minute ago. The war in 1861 is a very different thing from the war in 1865. In the war in 1861, it looks like it could have been part of the American Revolution. In 1865, it looks like the Somme and Ypres and the battlefields of World War I. And the development of that, and the participation of literally millions of Americans in that environment is a transformative event. And if you skip over it, I think you're missing a critical element of what the American Civil War did to the United States.
But just real quickly, but Craig, most of the studies, battle studies of the Civil War, and I even take that to often the tours that people go on, and not just National Park Service, but battlefield guides, that they tend to focus on the heroics of the fallen. So my point is that we are still getting a fairly romanticized view of warfare through battle studies. So battle studies have not been able to accomplish or achieve, but the three of you spoke about such eloquence about, again, military history. So I want to press here again and say, that battle studies, do they not really serve us the way you maybe are imagining?
When I think of that, Pete, I think of a wonderful series that Oxford University Press has, Pivotal Moments in American History, which a lot of those are wonderful battle studies by people like James McPherson, David Hackett Fisher. There's one on the Battle of the Monongahela from the French and Indian War. But what I think the good battle studies do, one reason that people love them, is they bring forward the contingency of history. That's what James McPherson does in his Antietam book. It's the decisions of people that are making a difference in the outcome of an event that is contingent, that could go in different directions, and then the decisions and the actions that people take and the unintended consequences of those actions resonate through time. And I think the best battle studies, like in that series, do that for us. Bad battle studies are something that only the hobbyist of a particular battle would be interested in, because they get us down into who turned right, who turned left. They tend to be polemic in terms of, we're going to bash this particular person, we're going to make these wild claims. So I think bad history is bad, and a bad battle study is bad. But a good battle study tells us about human action and its impact on events.
I'm glad you mentioned earlier about how difficult it is to write military history, and I echo that enthusiastically. Military history, battle studies is the hardest kind of history to write because the evidence is so conflicting. If there's no place for battle narrative, though, my 800-page Meade biography suddenly became about 100 pages tonight.
That's good news.
You're happy about that.
Very good news. I say I heard it.
That's the biggest success of the Fortenbaugh right now. So thinking about that, though, I obviously read a lot of battle narrative, and my favorite battle narratives are by non-academics, which might be sort of a sub-thread here, but if you've picked up Scott Hartwig's volumes on Antietam lately, all 800 pages of them, 2 volumes, Hartwig's battle narrative is brilliant because it moves into the tactical maneuvers of the particular regiments in Antietam, but he can also get elevation. He can study soldiers' lives and what the experience of the common soldier is, how the civilians at Sharpsburg are affected by a battle that comes into their community and causes 23,000 casualties. He has the concluding chapters that look at the impact of emancipation and what it is like for sort of strategic or geopolitical consequences of these battles. That's an excellent, I think it should be a model for how we do battle studies. It's intellectually capacious. It moves us beyond this unit moved there and there. John Hennessy's work on...
And it's 500 pages long as well. It's not always book is 500 pages.
I'm sure it's 800 with the...
Or is it 800?
It is 800.
800 pages, and it's the second volume.
And that actually, I gotta throw that in because that's a challenge. When I teach a military history class at Texas A&M, that's an upper division class, U.S. military history to 1901. And I purposely want to assign battle studies as the readings for that book because my view, for that class, because my view is this is the class where we can actually get into the weeds of battles. And I know my students love it, and so I want to do that for them. And honestly, it is so hard to find books to assign because so many battle historians write 800 pages, and my students are not. So I'm trying to find a good battle study that's about 250 pages, and it's really hard. I'm just throwing that in there. Write shorter books, people.
Don't clap at that.
That's one of points of best. It was John's your Marcel?
Yeah.
John, where are you?
Right there in the middle.
So, all the talk about these battle studies, it reminds me of how the American public during the war, their preoccupation with battles was keeping them from understanding what ultimately it was going to take for the North to subdue the South. These battles, they were great heavyweight matches. There would be a victor, they'd go back to their corners and they would fight again. There's a growing realization on the Union side, really beginning, I think, after Vicksburg, but certainly in 1864, that it's going to take logistics on the Union side and using those logistics in ways that it makes the Union armies more effective in tearing out the guts of the Confederate war machine. That's what's crucial here. But the people at the time, the Northern people, they keep looking to the battlefield. They keep thinking that that's where victory is ultimately going to be won. So here's my point. We have Marcel, who wrote a wonderful biography of Henry Halleck, and I think Harvard published it as well. Henry Halleck served, he's basically a high-level bureaucrat. Is that unfair? I think that's pretty fair.
I don't know.
He's a
John, is that fair?
Is that fair? Sort of. But the point is that our focus on battles today, the books that people want to read, here on the battlefields that we go and we visit, it seems to me that we're still doing, in a sense, a disservice to our public because they still are not understanding that the Civil War wasn't won really on the battlefield. Northern armies ultimately prevailed because of superior logistics, because of men like Henry Halleck and his ability to organize Union armies, and ultimately it was a raiding strategy that, again, tore the guts out of the Confederate war machine. So my point is that the kind of work that we're producing, that we keep saying resonates with our public, and it does, but is it truly relevant? Are we really giving the public the deep understanding of what it means to be a nation at war? We want to look at that community. We want to look at Bobby Joe, who deserved it, and how that affected his family's reputation. That's certainly important. But what we really need to understand is something that's drier, more complex, and hard to get at. John Marsalek did it with his Halleck biography. I'm wondering, as a field, though, are we not giving the people a true understanding of what it means to be a nation of war?
You remember we started this with Pete saying he wasn't going to give any lectures.
I said I was going to try not to.
I think, go ahead.
You go ahead.
I think the key to understanding what happened in the Civil War, it's a 4-year conflict. And the big question was, could the South hold out longer than the Northern public's tolerance of the losses and the costs of the war? We as a culture, we as a society are, quite frankly, an impatient people. If we don't get it today and tomorrow, we lose interest. And what the South was counting on, quite frankly, what Japan was counting on in 1941, was that this feckless society would lose interest and decide to negotiate and figure out some way to stop this thing because we just lost interest. And so, as long as the North could sustain its interest in that war, now logistics is a big part of that, but politics is a big part of that too. And I think the key figure is not Henry Halleck, sorry John, I think the key figure is Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln is the guy who managed to hold this together and get reelected in the middle of a war and keep the Union public focused on that objective long enough for it to play out. And absent that, we're two countries.
But this goes back to the importance of battle and campaign, because Abraham Lincoln only managed to get reelected because of the timing of Sherman's capture of Atlanta, of the victories in the Shenandoah Valley, the Mobile Bay campaign.
Thank you for Mobile Bay.
So to me, it's, Pete, I think if we say we're not giving a proper view if we focus as much on battles. If we just focus on them in isolation, I think you're right. But I think the point is that it actually is Union arms working in conjunction with the political scene and the cultural scene. Let's take the famous debate over what caused emancipation, for example, right? You are not going to have the end of slavery without Union Army campaigns operating. What brings the initial moment in South Carolina where enslaved people are able to emancipate themselves? It's the arrival of the Navy.
Thank you.
At Port Royal to capture coaling stations for the blockade. And then the next thing you know, the Navy is having to oversee refugee camps filled with freed people who have left. And it's that relationship between campaigns and these bigger pictures that creates the victory or the defeat. So I think they have to be discussed together.
I would just add, as we're sitting here in Gettysburg, that the greatest resource that military historians have and consumers of Civil War is the battlefield itself. So these books are only one component of understanding and enriching our appreciation for the American Civil War. I was chatting with people at the reception who were on my CWI tour some years ago up at Culp's Hill. We did the 137th New York, about what a fantastic experience that was to walk on the grounds of Culp's Hill, to get out and walk on the fields of Pickett's Charge, or walk the line of the 137th New York, go to Meade's headquarters at the Leicester House, stand on these hallowed grounds, and just consume this landscape. And I think you'll get your appreciation for some of these complexities and emotions that you're getting to, Pete, by the battlefield. And you all know that because you're veterans of tromping the battlefield yourself. This place matters, and that's why we've gathered here 160 years ago today.
That's worth underscoring. You two teach in Texas and Oklahoma, and can't take your students to the battlefield here. I taught at Annapolis, and every year brought my Civil War students up to Gettysburg for a full day. We did the tour, and you could tell the impact that had on them, the students. I mean, we'd read about it because we read The Killer Angels, right, of course. And when they stood on the little round top, you could feel the impact that had on them as young, blooming officers in the United States Navy and Marine Corps. and the impact that that had. So I think you're absolutely right.
Were there any naval sites you could take your students to that had that kind of impact? during the
No,
Civil War?
no, I'm saying water. It happened there.
Somewhere out there. We think.
Qumran just doesn't hold the same
No.
kind of cachet here.
No,
does
you
it?
really-
Qumran doesn't, okay. It doesn't.
So, is there anything left to say about the common soldier and Craig and the common sailor, right? Is there anything left? Because that's another very popular genre in the field of military history. Anything left to say about the common soldier?
Always. I mean, not only because that, after all, is the raw material of history from the ground up, which is a critical viewpoint. I mean, we have all written books about Meade, generals, Nimitz, admirals, looking down from 30,000 feet, managing a war and the people who work for them. But looking at that war from the bottom up, the way Stephen Crane, for example, did, helps us to appreciate the impact that that had on young people. And again, I think one of the critical questions about the war, one of the things that Pete asked us to think about is, are there any new questions about this? What motivated the individual soldier? And that's a tough question. Was every Union soldier out there because slavery is wrong and I'm going to fix it and we're going to emancipate the slaves? No. Was every Confederate soldier out there because slavery is a virtue and I'm going to defend it with my life? No. So why were they all there? What motivated them? And I think that question of motivation is central to understanding that war, and for that matter, every war. So yes, I think there's always something to be said about the common soldier, not just, what he ate and how he slept, and that more of them died from disease and from battle wounds, all of which are pertinent, but also what's going on in his head. And of course, Jim McPherson, our friend Jim, did a lot of this with soldiers' letters when he examined carefully what they said about why they were there, when they wrote home to their wives and sweethearts, mothers and fathers, about why they were there. That helps us get inside their heads and see the war from that level. So I think that's crucial.
I think the question of common soldiers and motivation has been pretty well covered, if not saturated. But I think there are some avenues still to explore. Two things come to mind, mostly because I want good secondary work on this while I'm writing my Meade project. One is a question of desertion and execution. And Pete has a chapter on that topic in his book, War for the Common Soldier, what desertion and execution looks like. The Army of the Potomac really struggles with this issue of desertion in the summer of 1863. They do sort of ritualized executions on Fridays. There are 5 soldiers from the 118th Pennsylvania executed in late August of 1863 at Beverly's Ford. So execution and desertion and how we should look at those soldiers in terms of cowardice or capital punishment, moral justice, how that is distributed, is one area I think could be further explored. And the second is common soldiers and combat effectiveness. Rather than talking about regiments and how common soldiers moved on a battlefield, 17th Virginia did this and this unit moved in this way, I think understanding the unit's cohesiveness and how it evolves and changes during the war is important. Particularly, take the Overland Campaign, for example. The Army of the Potomac that fought and won here under Meade's leadership in July of 1863 is not the Army of the Potomac in 1864. Those common soldiers have changed, and the war has changed them. So what combat effectiveness for these units is like is important. John Gibbon's division in the 2nd Corps in the Overland Campaign sustains 72% casualties. Killed, wounded, or captured. 72% casualties in the Overland Campaign. So a study on unit effectiveness as a way to think about common soldiers and their efficacy as instruments of war, I think is a wide open area, and I would love to see something on that.
Can I just jump in real quickly with a follow-up question? I think one of the things that all 3 panelists have pointed to how military history is usable history and how important it is to be able to connect with our students and our audiences so that they can see relevancy in it, which again, we all applaud. But sometimes in our desperate need to get attention and to be relevant, we take the past and we contort it to fit our present needs. And so that leads me to this issue of PTSD or trauma. I think when I hear from my students, what I hear from people when I'm on the battlefield, is a belief that any person who endured Civil War combat suffered some kind of trauma. So I'm curious about your take on that question. And again, about this other imperative to be relevant, to have a usable past. Has that caused us right now to make Civil War soldiers to look a lot like our perception of Vietnam soldiers?
One time at a Society for Civil War Historians conference, I invited one of my PhD students to come to lunch with me and a group of Civil War historians who were all women. So this young man, he came and we were having lunch, and the subject of Civil War trauma and soldiers and came up. And my graduate student said it's the greatest moment he had in his graduate career, because he watched these well-known scholars argue with each other till they were red in the face the entire lunch. And he said, I learned more from that conversation, because there were people at that lunch who took the position that trauma is physical and it is something that is universal and across time, how it is experienced and how it is processed. So soldiers who experienced Civil War combat had physical things happen to them that is analogous to, is the same as what we see today. The other group of people at the table said, there are physical experiences, but how we process them and how we assign meaning to them depends on your cultural values. And Civil War soldiers did not have the same cultural values that we have. They believed that suffering is redemptive. They believed, not all of them, but many of them, that suffering is redemptive, that suffering is good, that it's not something that you can avoid, it's something that you can overcome. And so their point was that how they experienced a wound is going to be different than someone who grows up in a culture that says you are an individual who should experience happiness and how the world treats you is important, versus someone who grows up with very different assumptions. I tend to fall myself a little more on that cultural side. I think we don't see the same kind of societal level of cynicism and trauma that we see after World War I. We see persistence of religious beliefs. We see persistence of hope. Now, I don't want to take that too far, because I think there are historians who have clearly shown Civil War soldier veterans who experienced incredible economic loss, trauma, mental illness, addiction. All of those things are present after the war. But I think we also see, for a large number of veterans, their experience is not Vietnam.
I'm currently writing a book about the Naval Academy class of 1940. Now, they're all gone now. This is the last four-year class to graduate before the Second World War. They were the junior officers who fought in the Second World War. So I've never had an opportunity to interview any of them, though I have many of their letters and diaries and memoirs. I've talked to their children. And what their children say is, my dad never said anything about the war. And one of the reasons was because, in my view, that they believed people who weren't there wouldn't get it. They just wouldn't understand. Why? I can't explain. First of all, I don't want to relive this. But secondly, I don't want to have to try to explain to you the environment and the context in which we all live. But they would talk about it with each other because they would understand. And I think that's probably similar to the way Civil War soldiers who experienced that trauma, they could talk to each other because they could understand. These reunions that took place in the 1870s and 1880s, on into the 1890s, the Grand Army of the Republic, they could talk to each other because they knew. But they had a hard time, most of them, telling anybody else who wasn't there what that was like. That's a form of trauma. It's a form of pulling back, of separating yourself. Yes, we say the greatest generation came back from that war and they all got jobs and they mowed the lawn and bought refrigerators and they lived in the suburban life and it was all well and good, but inside there was that secret thing they had they couldn't tell their kids about. Is that fair? Okay.
I'd like to finish with a question again. It is one that they are prepared for. It is one in which they are not making any political statements about the war in Gaza, but I think it's absolutely appropriate and necessary for you all to give us some insights about questions in studying civil war and military history that would help us have a better understanding of the war in Gaza. Again, I want to stress, they are not making any judgments about either side, but they are helping us with the kinds of inquiries or questions that we might pursue.
So I think a lot of Civil War historians recently have been really interested in questions about the international laws of war and how Americans North and South during the Civil War kind of handled accusations of atrocity and handled, when citizens and non-combatants get hurt. So, my recent work, I look at this ritual of retaliation that both sides use to try to negotiate. When the Union Army begins bombarding downtown Charleston and, they say, hey, you can't bomb this city. That goes against the rules of war. We have citizens in here. And Quincy Gilmore says, we've been operating against your city for 9 months. You should have evacuated your women and children. The laws of war say if you don't get your women and children out, I can bomb you. So all of these things that happen in the Civil War, both sides are making accusations. Both sides, for a world audience, they're very self-conscious that the world is looking at them and saying, should they have bombed this city? They just executed 52 guerrillas without trial. Is that legal? So I think an understanding of the propaganda aspects of war, the understanding of how people negotiate when war kind of spirals beyond what people initially thought it was going to be. Those questions are essential to the Civil War, and they can help us think about some of these issues currently.
Yeah, I think that's good. And piggybacking on Lorien's comment, remember that war and conflict is sort of an inherent natural state of mankind. It'd be more exceptional to study peace than war as it is. So whether we're talking about Gaza or we're talking about the Ukraine, some of these questions are kind of timeless. The issue of media and public opinion came to mind when Pete sent this question along. It was certainly something that's relevant in the Civil War. I think a lot of our interest in the Civil War comes through the fact that we see these photographs. It's the first war that's photographed extensively, not the first war to be photographed, but it shapes public opinion. And now you can watch the war in the Ukraine or the crisis in Gaza play out on social media in real time and how that influences popular opinion. And I think the question of displaced peoples is one that's relevant. What war means is often displaced peoples, whether that's in Gaza or Atlanta or South Vietnam or Berlin. Some of those questions have applicability back to the Civil War too.
One of the central writers that we study at the Naval War College in Newport is Carl Clausewitz. And Clausewitz wrote, we want to talk about 800-page books, Steve. This is a monster book on war, Vom Krieg. But it can be, the essence of it can be boiled down to a relatively simple phrase, which most of you have probably heard. War is politics by other means. War is an instrument that governments use to achieve an objective. And what he emphasizes is the importance of identifying with clarity what that objective is. What's the end game? What do we want? How much will it cost to get that thing we want? How much resistance are we likely to encounter from the foe in achieving that objective? And unless you have clarity on those things, you're going to find yourself in a terrible mess. And I think that applies to both of the wars that are going on in the world today. I hope whoever initiated these things, I hope the participants in these things have a clear vision of the end game, the outcome, what's going to exist after it's over. And my great fear is that may not be true, perhaps in either case. So they should all have gone to the Naval War College.
Craig, that's a great point, because I'm just reminded of Lincoln, whose first plans for Reconstruction during the war was him envisioning a peace in which the North and South would find a way to come back together. At the very end, when he gives Grant instructions, when Petersburg and Richmond are on the cusp of falling, what did he say to Grant? Go easy on them. Lincoln always had in mind what that peace should look like, and he understood that the war that they were waging, that it would determine whether that peace would be achieved or not. We have just a few moments. My eyesight's not great, I would admit, but I don't see any microphones out there. Where are they? Oh, they're right here. In front of me. I told you my eyesight was okay. We have just a little bit of time. Notice I want to stress this. This is a time for questions. It's not a time for commentary or observations. Questions. So if you have any questions for our panelists, please, they need to walk up to the front here. And I think we have someone coming right now. Zeev is coming. Come on, Zeev. I'm just going to boast about Zeev real quickly before he asks his question. I will. Zeev graduated from Gettysburg College last year. He's been a Pohanka intern. He's worked at Eisenhower. He's worked at Andersonville. He worked at Special Collections. He's now finishing his master's at West Virginia University.
I just started, not finished.
That's right. Sorry, Zeev. Boy, hey, correcting your professor still. There's no repercussions for that now. All right, Zeev, go right ahead.
So I believe it was Dr. Foote who said that in terms of battle studies, part of the difficulty comes from so many conflicting accounts. Now I know I've taken course with Dr. Carmichael, I've taken course with Dr. Reardon, looking at that and how that plays into memory. So my question for the panel is, to what extent, if you're just a standard military historian and not studying historical memory, to what extent does that historical memory play into writing battle study and studying military history?
You want to start?
Okay, I'll start. Thank you for that question, which is an important one. And just to echo again, military history is the hardest kind of history to write. So for me, when I'm working on a battle or a campaign, I always look for the contemporary source first. So I want the letters that are written during the Overland Campaign. I want the common soldiers' views during the Overland Campaign, Meade's letters written during the Battle of Gettysburg, for instance, so I get the immediacy of the event. That's what I privilege and prioritize. I try to avoid, or at least rely on less, soldiers or veterans accounts written after 1865, for the reason that you're alluding to. The further you get from the event, war is inherently chaotic. There's no more event that we experience that is as chaotic and disruptive as war, so it's confusing. It's fog of war, right? So as time passes, those memories are going to fade, or you have a political agenda to pursue, or you're going to try to revitalize the story to privilege yourself and your unit. So I think for me at least, doing military history, the contemporary accounts have to be the loudest voices. And then if I have to pull something later to maybe supplement a story, I will. But I think the eyewitness accounts are paramount.
We're going to need to move it a little bit. Thank you so much, Zeev.
Thanks, guys. Also, I just want to say the Mountaineers are having a great season.
But, Zeev, you're not a sports fan. I can't believe you.
Now I am.
Now I am. I'm not going to give a bio for each person, but it's hard for me not to, because I see my former students. That means a great deal to me. Wes graduated last year at Georgetown. You can correct me too if you like Zeev did. You are just starting at Georgetown. Security studies? I got it all right. Good. All right, thanks, Wes. Go right ahead.
Good evening, all. Thank you for being here. So, one thing that I've noticed, both in my graduate program now, and then I also intern at the National War College, so Joint Professional Military Education, the field of military history has lost a lot of those people that want to study military operations to political science, international relations, security studies, and myself included. I'm technically now in the security studies program, but the majority of what I'm doing is operational military history. How do we bring people back to the field writ large? And certainly in the United States, we have this problem where there aren't a lot of graduate degrees you could get in military history that include both those cultural and gendered elements, but also the operational aspects, things down to the tactical level, things of the efficacy of an M4 versus an M16, because that is part of the equation. Because of just the disposition of graduate school, it seems that we've pushed that away. particularly in the UK, where they have 8 million grad programs for military history. But the people that get PhDs there typically have a harder time getting jobs in American academia. So how do we fix this problem writ large?
I don't know. I mean, that is an absolutely great question. I mean, you're right about the movement of graduate study programs into national security studies, political science, and those areas, which may be perfectly valid. I don't know. I'm not casting aspersions, but I am. I think the difficulty is the reason people do that, and I suspect the reason you've done that, is the number of jobs available at academic institutions or other institutions for operational military historians is so finite that your chances of being employed are vastly increased if you move over into national security studies. And so it has to begin with, I think, institutions like ours recognizing that there is a need in a field that needs to be strengthened in operational military history. That's going to take a while. That's not going to happen overnight. There isn't a quick fix for that. It's cultural.
But I do have to throw in, the irony is that for my institution, Texas A&M, all of our operational historians have jobs, whereas that's not the case for some of our other graduate students, because we place so many students in the U.S. Army Center for Military History. There's a lot of public history jobs or federal government jobs in military history. So we actually have great success, and I think there will always be that need for that kind of operation. You know, it's not just academics. There's a lot of operational history jobs with the federal government, and I think that will continue to produce military history programs to meet that need. So that at least is going to hold us steady for a while, to answer your question, and then how it grows from there, I don't know.
Great, thank you. Sally, how are you? Good, it's great to see you. Sally was in my Civil War class. It's COVID days, wasn't it? She's getting embarrassed. She was a fantastic student. Go ahead, Sally.
Good evening. I did not major in history while I was in Gettysburg College, so it might be a stupid question. But is it fair to say that the Union Army won because of heavier battalion? Is it true that the Union Army really have more resources? And if so, why does the Confederacy Army even secede? Thank you.
I didn't answer those questions for you in class. This is an indictment of my teaching, Sally. That's rough.
I often used to tell my students that yes, the Union has the advantage of numbers. You can count it any way you want to. Railroad mileage, steamships, major cities, manpower, personnel, financial resources, access to, a navy. I mean, these things are crucial, and you can count them, and you put them on a chart, and the bar graphs go way over here. You say, oh, the poor Confederacy. But on the other hand, remember what I said earlier about you have to identify the objective. What does the South have to do to win? Not lose. What does the North have to do to win? Conquer 2 million square miles of territory and occupy it forever. The bar is so high on what the Union has to do, the fact that it succeeded in doing that is really rather remarkable. Yes, it's comforting to the lost cause supporters to say, well, we were overcome by numbers and money, but we what did we do? We beat the spread. I guess. But on the other hand, if you examine it from the point of view of what the Union had to do to win that war, stay it for 4 years, conquer the entire South, break their will, that's a huge job, and it's astonishing that they were able to do it.
Yeah, there's I'll just make a quick point, that great anecdote of relative to Gettysburg where all these Confederate veterans are lamenting their loss, and what does Pickett say? I think the Union Army had something to do with it. So let's start talking about Gettysburg as Meade's victory rather than Lee's defeat.
Hello, my name is Katie. I'm a sophomore at Gettysburg College. Thank you for being here tonight. My question is more career-oriented. So my end goal is to be a military history professor, but I'm trying to figure out the path to get there. So my question for you, which I'm curious about, is what do you think the field will look like in 20 years from now? And do you think it's impossible to, become a military history professor, especially in a foreign country like the UK?
Well, I mean, we just placed one of our graduate students as a military historian in the UK. So I think that there's always going to be, for the reasons that I said, we have huge militaries around the world that have an interest in maintaining military history. The U.S. Army, the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Air Force, the U.S. Marines, they want military historians. They utilize military historians. So we're always going to have PME. We're always going to have PhD institutions. At Texas A&M, we always have at least 2 or 3 active duty military officers getting their PhD, because then they're going to go on and use that later in their career. So these kind of active duty officers need academic military programs to get their PhDs in. So it's in the interest of universities to maintain those programs. I just don't see military history going away in 20 years. There's some challenges, but because of this demand by the government, by military institutions to keep studying this, we're going to keep studying it. And I think the big name programs like North Carolina, Ohio State, Southern Mississippi right now has this incredible military history program with 7 military historians. I'm not worried that you're going to be able to, if you want to do military history, you're going to be able to do it.
Thank you, that's a really relief to hear.
Let me add to that, if I may, that when I was an undergraduate student, I went home, I was home on break for some reason. I was at UCLA and I came home on a break and having a conversation with my parents, and I said, military history is so fascinating to me. I want to make this my career. I want to go to graduate school. I want to get a PhD. I want to do military history. And my mother looked at me and said, "Oh, honey, you know nobody's ever going to pay you to do that." But I loved it, and I did it anyway, and somebody paid me to do it. So do what you love.
And particularly, it's good to see women in military history, so absolutely pursue your career in military history.
And that is a trend. There are more and more women in military history. I got to speak at Gettysburg College. Our Pohanka fellows, I don't know what the percentage is, but it's at least 50+% that are women as well. So it is a good trend in the field. The last thing I just wanted to note is that all the questions came from Gettysburg College students. Pretty impressive. And then the final thing I want to say is, you all know this was an experiment, and I think that it worked exceedingly well. Our panelists did a fantastic job. Lorien, Craig, and Jen. Thank you so much for taking your time to be here.
Oh, we definitely have to do this again.
On behalf of Gettysburg College, I'd like to say thank you to Professors Foote, Murray, Symonds, and Carmichael for the lively and informative discussion tonight, and also to Triana Chavis of the Civil War Institute for her work in organizing this event. As a reminder, immediately following, there'll be a book signing in the gallery, as well as some of the speakers' books for sale. So from the history department here at Gettysburg College, our thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. Safe travels home and our best wishes for a very happy Thanksgiving holiday. Good night.